Okay. All right. So welcome to our June Lunch and Learn on Transformative Justice 101. I'm really excited to have Lizzie here presenting for us today. I work with her at the Coalition. She's also a fantastic pseudo mom for Odie, my dog. She and her dog and Odie get along really well. So I'm very thankful for Lizzie in all the ways, but especially for being here today. I'm going to do a quick introduction of her and then I will let her take it away. So Lizzie Rice is the DOH, which is Department of Health Program Specialist for the Tennessee Coalition. She focuses primarily on prevention of sexual assault. Lizzie began her professional career working as a paralegal to a public defender, where she worked with people from all backgrounds charged with various types of crimes, both violent and nonviolent. In her current position, she conducts statewide trainings on sexual assault prevention and bystander intervention training, as well as chairing the Coalition's statewide Sexual Assault Prevention Committee. Previously, she worked in the Coalition Sexual Assault Legal Clinic, where she worked directly with the victim and survivors of sexual and domestic assault. Lizzie, thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You make me sound cooler than I actually am. Hi everyone, my name is Lizzie. I use she, her pronouns. And before we get started, I want to do a land acknowledgement specifically because these practices are deeply rooted in Indigenous practices. And I think we need to give credit where credit's due and acknowledge that. So I would like to acknowledge the unceded and occupied land of the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Yuchi First Nations, for which we're learning and working from today. So today we're going to talk about both restorative and transformative justice, how they differ and where they intersect, as well as the basic principles of these and how they compare to our current criminal justice system. So this presentation is going to focus on the basic principles. It's not necessarily going to be a how-to. I do hope to have a follow-up to this presentation where we can discuss different ways different communities have implemented these practices. But an important thing to know about transformative and restorative justice, and you may hear me refer to these as TJ and RJ. But the important thing to remember is there is no blueprint or roadmap. Practices centered around these theories and practices will look different from one place to another. What might work well for one community may not work well for another. So implementing these practices will take some trial and error to figure out what works best. So that being said, knowing the principles and basic tenets of transformative and restorative justice, that will guide the steps to implementation of the practices. So if we can go skip to the next slide and then the next slide. Okay, so here we go. What's the difference? So we have three concepts I want to talk about when it comes to transformative practices. And those are, the first one is community accountability. And when we're talking about community accountability, or the community and community accountability, that doesn't necessarily mean a geographic location. It can be an online community, it could be a work community, a collective, any sort of group. So community accountability is a community strategy rather than a police prison-based strategy. An example of this would be like mutual aid, where community members voluntarily exchange resources and services for mutual benefit. A lot of mutual aid organizations have formed since COVID-19 to address the needs of folks who are not having their basic needs met. An example of that would be like community fridges, and there have actually been a lot of those popping up, specifically in Nashville. And I'm so sorry, I think someone might have their audio on. If you don't mind muting, thank you. Sorry about that. So the next one is transformative justice. If Chloe, you can click, I think it should pop up. There we go, yes, so transformative justice. So transformative justice can use restorative justice practices individually. The objectives are addressing roots of violence and transforming the environment that allowed harm to occur. It also says that restoration is not enough, and it's also considered a theoretical framework. And then lastly, we have restorative justice. And restorative justice focuses on the person who experienced harm and repairing that harm. Restoration comes through community healing and is primarily a practice. So we can go to the next slide. So why transformative justice? Transformative justice borrows most of its concepts and intersects with teachings and values of restorative justice. They are at their core the same thing. However, transformative justice practices and procedures emphasizes, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm a little troubled today. So transformative justice emphasizes practices and procedures that are believed to only be able to work outside of traditional systems like the education system or the criminal justice system. Restorative practices can be implemented in communities without these traditional systems, but they don't specifically rule them out as a part of its core principles. For example, you may see a lot of restorative justice practices or models being implemented in places like schools and prisons. Transformative justice differs from restorative in the literal sense of the words, because to restore something to the way that things were prior to harm being committed and being restored to those conditions might not be a desirable outcome, because those conditions could have very well been the thing that created the harm in the first place. So transformative justice seeks to transform and create more safe community, to create a more safe community that's free from harm. While they differ in some ways, they're ultimately founded on the same principles. Both TJ and RJ center victims' needs and offender accountability. Both of these practices recognize that harm and interpersonal conflict are rooted in oppression, and it works to change those conditions that maintain and sustain oppressive and exploitive conditions. They work to meet individual needs for justice, such as safety, healing, and accountability. So next slide. So now we're going to talk about what they are not. So before we go into more depth about the core values, let's talk about what they're not. So it is primarily not about forgiveness or reconciliation, although it can be, but that's really up to the victim survivor. There's a lot of apprehension, I think, by victim and victim advocates around restorative justice practices, because I think they can be perceived as a way to pressure the victim into forgiving the person that caused them harm. But the idea is really to give the victim a voice in the process. While they can forgive their abuser if they should decide to, they absolutely do not have to. The primary focus is what's best for the victim survivor and should never be seen or about coddling the offender. It's also not mediation. Even though many restorative justice programs are designed around the possibility of a facilitated encounter, it may not always be the appropriate approach. There is always the possibility that an offender has not been identified or is unwilling to participate. So restorative practices can't be limited to this kind of encounter. It also shouldn't be viewed as mediation, because the mediation approach assumes that all parties are on an even moral playing field and that the responsibility is shared, which is specifically in cases of sexual assault or any kind of violence that's been committed. That can further the trauma of the victim survivor by approaching it as a conflict dispute. There's also no specific model for implementing restorative practices. There's still a steep learning curve in this field. New practices are emerging and evolving and will continue to do so through dialogue and experimentation. It's said that restorative and transformative justice practices are not roadmaps, but compasses offering direction of where we want to be. And then lastly, in its current practice, restorative justice is most certainly not an answer to all situations involving harm. Even in a perfect world, it's still not entirely clear that It should replace any legal system. Our current legal system focuses on the public aspect of crime, while restorative and transformative justice seek to address harm at the individual level. Practices could potentially be implemented to improve our current criminal justice system, or could work alongside as a way to support victims and reduce harm. So next slide. So here are the main objectives of restorative and transformative justice practices. So it seeks to put the most important decisions and outcomes in the hands of those most affected. This could mean the victim and those in close proximity to the victim who were directly affected by the crime. This is important because it gives those who were harmed a sense of control. And it also gives other stakeholders, such as community members, a voice in the process. It also seeks to make justice centered around healing by addressing harm directly and then working with the people most impacted to make it as right as possible. So creating a dialogue where the victim or victims are leading the conversation can also shed light, not just for the person causing the harm, but give us the information we need to prevent future crimes. Let's see, yes. So achieving those goals means that victims are involved in the process and satisfied with the outcome. Offenders understand their actions and how they have affected other people. There has to be specific plans for victim and offenders to repair harm, and victims and offenders gain a sense of closure. All right, next slide. So we're going to, here's some more differences between our current criminal justice system and transformative justice. So the criminal justice system is founded on the idea that crime is a violation of law, that violations create guilt, and that justice requires punishment. So when we ask the question, what does justice require? The traditional criminal justice system says that the focus is on the offender getting what they deserve. So next slide. So restorative justice answers the question of what justice requires by saying the focus should first and foremost be on needs and obligations. It says that crime is a violation of people and relationships, that violations create obligations, and that justice involves victims, offenders, and community members in an effort to right the wrongs. All right, next. So 3 questions that we can ask ourselves when we also see the different, excuse me, I drank a lot of coffee before this, so now it's hitting me. We can also see the difference in these 2 approaches to crime by other questions that are asked when achieving justice. So the criminal justice system asks what laws have been broken, as in what evidence exists to support the charge. It also asks who did it, what evidence exists that points to this offender, and then what do they deserve? What statutory punishment should be imposed? So as you can see, based on these questions, the criminal justice system leans more on and is centered around the defendant and their conduct. It also gives the defendant the presumption of innocence. So the process of a criminal trial is really centered around proving whether or not the defendant did in fact commit the crime that they're being charged with, which obviously that's important. That's a really important aspect of the justice process, holding the right person accountable. However, this version of justice does not encourage the offender, if guilty, to take responsibility by admitting they committed the offense. It's the job of the state to prove that they are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that process doesn't leave a lot of space for the victim to have a voice in the process. So that's in contrast to transformative, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, there we go. That's in contrast to what transformative and restorative justice ask, which is who has been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these? So these are the values. So restorative and transformative justice is based on a basic understanding of wrongdoing. Although it's expressed itself in different ways in different cultures, this approach is common in most traditional societies. So restorative and transformative practices say that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. These violations create obligations, and that the central obligation is to repair the harm that's been done. So the underlying idea about wrongdoing here is the assumption that we are all interconnected. In this view, the problem with crime is that it represents a tear in the web of community, and crime represents damaged relationships. In fact, under this view, damaged relationships are both the cause and result of crime. So next slide. So restorative justice practices are centered around roles and needs. So a little background on the restorative justice movement. The most, I would say, recent iteration of the movement, at least in the United States, appeared in the 1970s from the practice of peacemaking criminology, which was an alternative to traditional retributive criminal justice system. And that emerged from peace churches like the Mennonite community. Those practices were heavily based off of and very much influenced by the practices of First Nations people of Canada, the United States, and New Zealand. So the practice began in the 1970s as a way to rethink the needs crime creates and the roles within crime when it occurs. So restorative justice seeks to expand the circle of stakeholders, as in those who have a stake or standing in the outcome outside of the government or the offending party. Needs and roles are core to this framework. In this framework, there are three basic roles. There is the victim or the person who has experienced harm. One main concern of restorative and transformative practices is that the victims of crime are not having their needs adequately served by the criminal justice system. If you have worked as an advocate or in any proximity to victims of crime, you've probably seen where victims feel like they have been ignored or left out of the justice process. In fact, the criminal justice system or the state's interest can be in direct conflict with the victim's interest. This is partly because of the legal definition of crime. Since crime is defined as against the state, it's the state that takes the place of the victim in legal proceedings. And you'll see that, if you see a charging document or any kind of pleading in a criminal court, it'll say state of Tennessee versus offender. So it's the state that takes the place of the victim in the proceedings, and that leaves a lot of their basic needs neglected. Some of the needs that victims have, I'm sorry, we might need to go to the next. Can you click it? Yeah, there we go. Okay, actually, let's go back a slide. I'm sorry. Let me talk about some of the needs. Okay, here we go. Okay, so some of the needs for victims, one would be information. Victims need answers to questions they have about the offense. And in most cases, that can only come from the offender. And that includes the why and the how and the what has happened since. There's an emphasis on the need for real information, not speculation or arguments made in legal proceedings. This requires direct or indirect access to the person who holds that information. And in most cases, that's going to be the person who committed the offense. Also, truth telling. A really important part of healing is the opportunity to tell the story of what happened. Trauma often stems from the fact that when we experience harm, it disrupts our views of ourselves in the world, and storytelling is a way to transcend that experience. It also gives the victim the opportunity to tell the person who caused them harm the impact of their actions and give them an understanding of what they've gone through. Also, empowerment is a need. Victims also often feel like they don't have control or that control's been taken away from them. So direct involvement in their case can be a way of restoring that sense of control and in turn empowering them. And then restitution or vindication. So restitution is an important aspect of addressing harm because it can restore actual loss and because of the symbolic recognition that it implies. When someone who has caused harm makes an effort to right the wrong, even partially, it's a way of saying, I'm taking responsibility and you are not to blame. However, in some cases, restitution may not directly address the harm being caused, especially in the context of violent crime. Restitution can help provide and support and resources that can aid the victim with other losses surrounding their assault. So the next role is the offender. And a major part of restorative justice is ensuring accountability for offenders. While punishment, for example, a prison sentence can be incorporated into restorative justice practices, there is more of an emphasis on encouraging offenders to understand the consequences. A theory within the restorative justice practice is the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence or severe punishment. While that may be deserved, it is a distinctive for an offender to tell the truth. And the truth telling is an integral and important part of the restorative justice because it theorizes that punishment is not real accountability. Real accountability means facing what one has done. It means encouraging those who have been caused harm to understand the impact of what they have done and urging them to take the steps to make things as right as possible. And then lastly, we have the community. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Accountability, encouragement. Oh, my bad. I'm having a hard time kind of seeing. Accountability is another need and role. This addresses the resulting harm and encourages empathy and responsibility to transform shame. There's also encouragement, encouragement to experience personal transformation by healing the harms that contributed to their offending behavior, including personal and historical traumas, and opportunities for treatment, for example, addiction or other behaviors. And then we have, next. I think we can go to the next slide. So restorative justice, as you'll see on the screen, prefers inclusive and collaborative and consensual outcomes. This means that the victim and those who have been harmed steer the ship with input from the community stakeholders, as opposed to like a judge imposing a sentence mandated by statute that may not take into account the circumstances of the crime and may not provide the victim a sense of closure or justice. Restorative justice also recognizes the role of the state. So although in some instances, these two ideas about justice and their values may be in conflict, restorative justice recognizes and acknowledges the place for adversarial approaches and the role of professionals such as judges, lawyers, prosecutors, etc. It also encourages participation. There's a big emphasis on stakeholders being a part of the process in a substantial way. You can go to the next slide. So a big part of restorative and transformative practices, as we've discussed, is responsibility needs to lie on the offender. Making things right is central to the restorative and transformative practices. In this process, the burden falls on the offender, who, in order for this process to work, has to admit that what they have done and what they have done has caused harm. It also seeks to repair and restore harm, but in some cases, there is no repairing or going back to how things were before. Even in the best intentions and efforts, not all harm can be repaired. While the offender can work towards making things right, either symbolically or in a concrete way, it's important to remember that the journey is that of the victims. Sometimes the term healing can be inadequate because there is a sense of finality and the process is ongoing. So an effort to assist the victim's journey can happen, but things may never truly be restored. And then repairing harm requires that we address the harm that causes crime. Another important part of restorative and transformative processes from the offender's responsibility is the obligation to address the cause of their behavior. However, they usually can't do this alone because there may be a bigger obligation beyond the offender's direct responsibility. This can mean that there are much bigger systemic issues at hand that cause the conditions for which the harm was done. As we talked about earlier, I worked as a paralegal for many years to a public defender. And in my time working with this particular attorney, I got a really up close and personal look at people who committed crimes, their lives, basically. So an example I think of a lot is someone we represented who was charged with a bank robbery. And this person, to me, it was really clear that they didn't actually want to commit this crime. They took no steps to conceal their identity. They did not bring a weapon. In fact, when they arrived at the bank, they were approached by a banker about opening a checking account. And they told me that this banker was so kind to them that they considered actually not going through with the robbery. So this person came from a really difficult background growing up. They were in the foster care system and had a lot of behavior problems, which resulted in them being in DCS custody, which is Department of Children's Services, quite frequently. They didn't have their high school diploma or their GED. They had a pretty lengthy criminal record, mostly of minor infractions, but all of those factors made it really difficult for them to find a job. So this person robbed the bank because they didn't have money for rent. And they were about to be evicted. And they had a couple of days to come up with this money. So this person explained to me that they believed this was their only option. They could rob the bank and get caught, and then they wouldn't have to worry about rent. Or maybe they would be able to escape justice temporarily and still have a place to live. And when you think about this, those aren't really choices, right? Because we're talking about the basic human need for shelter. Because of those conditions they were put into as a child and living in, they took the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, that involved committing a crime. So that being said, this should, not serve as a way to mitigate responsibility of the offender or the offending behavior, and in no way should be used to lessen the perception of the damage caused to a victim. But the idea that the offender should be held accountable and acknowledging the harm that may have been done to them prior to their actions can exist simultaneously, right? That doesn't mean that we, excuse their behavior. We don't necessarily have to have sympathy, but no matter what our feelings are about people who have caused harm, we can't expect that offending behavior to stop without addressing those issues. So next slide. So when we are, to sum it up, according to restorative and transformative practices, we're working towards justice when we focus on the harms of wrongdoing more than the rules that have been broken. We also want to show equal concern and commitment to victims and offenders, involving them both in the process of justice. We want to work towards the restoration of victims, empowering them to respond to their needs, support offenders while encouraging them to understand and accept their obligations. We also want to recognize while obligations may be difficult for offenders, they should not be intended as harms, and they must be achievable. So we also want to provide opportunities for dialogue, direct or indirect, between victims and offenders as appropriate. We also want to involve and empower the affected community through the justice process and increase its capacity to recognize and respond to community bases of crime. We also want to encourage collaboration rather than coercion and isolation. And we want to give attention to unintended consequences of our actions and programs, while also showing respect to all parties, including victims, offenders, and justice colleagues. All right, so next slide. So like I stated at the beginning of the presentation, there is no real blueprint for how practices should work. However, we can look at some of the programs that are currently being used. These practices are based off traditional and common sense practices of justice that were repressed by colonization, and they have the potential to be in conflict with our current systems. However, these practices can provide the framework for adapting them in a way that can operate within our modern legal system. So, I'm sorry, can I go back one? Oh, I'm sorry, no, we were on the right slide, I apologize. I need my glasses. So these are some of the examples of the practices that you can use to facilitate justice. So there are victim offender conferences. Victim offender conferencing is a process that provides the consenting victim of the crime the opportunity to meet the offender in a safe and structured setting, with the goal of holding the offender directly accountable for their behavior while providing important assistance and compensation to the victim. These conferences are done with the assistance of a trained facilitator. The victim is able to let the offender know how the crime affected them, as well as get answers to questions they may have, and to be directly involved in developing a restitution plan for the offender to be accountable for the losses they incurred. In these types of conferences, the offender should be able to take direct responsibility for their behavior and understand the full impact of what they did, and to develop a plan for making amends for their violation. So research obtained by an organization called the Restorative Justice of Northwest Wisconsin has shown that victims of crime who meet with their offender are far more likely to be satisfied with the justice system response than victims who go through the traditional justice system. And that after confronting the offender, the victims are significantly less likely to be fearful of being re-victimized, and that the offenders who meet their victims are far more likely to successfully complete their restitution obligations and to be directly accountable to the victim for their behavior. There are also considerably fewer and less serious crimes committed by offenders who meet their victims. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so we just talked, okay, yeah. So next one is the family group conferencing, or FSGs. So that involves a community of people most affected by the crime, the victim and the offender, as well as the family, friends, and key supporters of both. This approach is similar to victim offender conferences in that they need to be managed by a trained facilitator in order to participate. The victim has to consent to the process, and the victor has, and the offender has to admit to the offense. Participation by all involved is voluntary. The conferences typically begin with the offender describing the incident, followed by each participant describing the impact of the incident on their life. It is preferable to allow the victim to start the discussion if they wish to. The goals are similar to the victim offender conference in that it provides the opportunity for the victim to be involved in the process. And then we have peace circles, which if you have read anything about transformative justice, this may be the practice that you're most familiar with. So this approach was adapted from First Nation communities in Canada. In this practice, participants sit in a circle and pass a talking piece around that assures everyone has the opportunity to speak, one person at a time. Generally, this method, you'll have one or two circle keepers to facilitate the encounter. And this approach involves a wider circle of participants and stakeholders. All right, so next slide. So different models have different goals. If you'll click. So as an alternative or diversionary program, these programs aim to divert cases from or provide an alternative to either all or in some part of the criminal justice process or sentencing. So prosecutors may make a recommendation or a referral to a restorative justice program. Court administration or personnel may or may not be involved in the process, and it may be implemented at different levels or in different phases of the criminal justice process. So healing or therapeutic programs, this is a process that has been developed to address the most severe types of crimes, specifically violent crimes. Often this is done post-sentencing and the offender is serving a prison sentence, and it's not designed to impact the outcome of the case. With appropriate planning and structure, these models have been found to be profound positive experiences for both victims and offenders. And then we have transitional programs. This is a process model that is similar to the other two, except for this process is implemented after or towards the end of an offender's prison sentence during their transition back into the community. This is a way to offer support and encouragement for the offender's transition and to hold them accountable to help them succeed into integrating back into the community and helping them become productive sentences. All right, next slide. So like we discussed earlier, there's no real, blueprint or roadmap to how to implement these strategies. There will be times where some of the models aren't appropriate or applicable to certain situations. For example, if an offender has not been identified or apprehended, you have to consider other ways and other practices that will still give victims a voice and an opportunity to address their concerns so that invested parties can help the victim with their needs. All right, so questions to ask when you are wanting to implement a restorative or transformative practice. So does this model address harms, needs, and causes for all involved? Is it adequately oriented to the needs of those who have been most harmed? Are those who offended encouraged to take responsibility? Are all relevant parties or stakeholders involved? Is there an opportunity for dialogue and participatory decision-making? Is this model respectful to all parties? And does this model treat all equally while maintaining awareness and addressing imbalances of power? Okay, so that wraps up my part of the presentation. So I'm hoping we can have a discussion, maybe get some questions, and then have a little bit of discussion. If Chloe would be so kind to help me moderate.
Of course, thank you so much, Lizzie. This was so awesome and informative. I will admit that I know very little about transformative justice, so I was really excited to hear your presentation today.
Thank you. And like I said, I'm hoping to have some kind of a follow-up that discusses more in depth different practices that are being implemented using these models.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? You folks at home on the Zoom? And I did get a message from Megan. She had to leave early for another meeting, but she wanted to say thank you.
Great. I love Megan. Well, if anyone thinks of any questions, I think my email's up on the screen, so you can always email me. And then hopefully, like I said, in the future, we can do another presentation or another training about other practices and go more in depth.
I did have sort of a question. And you talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to see if you had any other thoughts on it. But where is the best place to start with transformative justice? So what agencies need to kind of take the lead in this to really push this, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it kind of depends. There are a lot of different beliefs and theories around these practices. Like I mentioned in the presentation, where there's a belief that these practices cannot work in traditional systems because they are in conflict with our traditional values. It's really more of a community-based strategy. So I think that's probably the best place to start is in the community at an interpersonal level. But again, this all goes, the victim survivor has to be the one leading the model, I guess is what you would call it. They need to consent to it. They need to have the biggest voice, and they get to decide the outcome.
Yeah. Awesome. Beatrice also said thanks, Lizzie. All right, y'all. Well, if there's no other questions, like Lizzie said, her email address is on here. I'm sure she doesn't mind for you reaching out if you have any questions or any follow-up to this. And hopefully we can get you back for part 2 of this. I think this would be really, really good. So y'all have a great Thursday evening, Thursday afternoon, and a great weekend. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll stay on with you, Chloe, if you want to breathe.
All right, awesome. How do I stop recording?
Thank you.